Welcome back to another episode of Litigious, the number one podcast for legal discussion of stories in the news. I'm Scott Peterson. Giovanna is with me here as usual. A lot of stuff in the news this week, but before that, reminder, this podcast is brought to you by Durazio Peterson, a plaintiff's side serious and catastrophic injury and employment law firm in New York and also in Massachusetts and Vermont. If you have questions about any of those issues, feel free to reach out to us at our website, duraziopeterson.com, or through social media at Durazio Peterson. If you enjoy the podcast, please like, subscribe, share it with your friends. We get a lot of good feedback from people that we run into, some of whom don't even know that we are the ones behind the microphone, as I learned this weekend. But thanks as always for listening. So let's start with not to toot my own horn, but a prediction that I made that came true, which is a settlement in the Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni lawsuit that was headed for trial. And I think the settlement came as a pretty good surprise to people who were paying attention, although those of us who do this kind of work are probably not quite as surprised. Why don't you talk about what we know, which is actually not all that much because the terms are confidential, right?
Yeah, so I just want to be vain for 1 second and acknowledge that if anyone's watching this, my hair is in a weird high ponytail because I just got back from the gym. That anyway. Okay, yes. So this was the news on Monday, I believe, that this case finally settled. And yes, I will give you the credit for predicting that because even though I think settling is the normal, regular sort of expected thing to happen, this case was so contentious that it did not seem like to me that it would settle. And it seemed in some ways that especially Baldoni was going to kind of like fight to the death over this. What's sort of interesting about it, about the settlement, is that the rumors out there, and I've heard a couple different relatively reputable news sites say that they confirmed this, which is that no money is changing hands. So what that means is that Blake Lively at this point is the only plaintiff that's left because Justin Baldoni's counterclaims against her have been dismissed long ago. So that basically means that she gave up her case and decided not to move forward with it. We are unaware, if it's true that no money changed hands, then that's literally what happened. She decided to discontinue her case. Um, Typically a settlement, that is not what happens. Typically a settlement is the defendant pays you some large-ish or, relatively appropriate amount of money, and then you drop your claims.
Yeah, I don't know that it's completely unprecedented. There could have been, my guess is that there was some mutual agreement, whether it was not disparage one another, or obviously to keep the terms confidential. There are some terms that were agreed upon, but for all intents and purposes, you're right. She went through this litigation and spent, I'm gonna go ahead and take a stab, upwards of multiple millions of dollars on attorney's fees and had her name dragged through the mud and that of her friends, and ultimately walked away with not much, or nothing. So that's a tough pill to swallow, I'm sure, but it's probably one where, you're on the eve of a trial. The trial was not, as far as I know, going to be somehow confidential. Everything that was, said in the trial would probably come out. There may not have been, an open courtroom for cameras and that sort of thing, but either way, everybody hears about what's said at the trial, and maybe they just thought that was too much to risk, and it was just going to be too inflammatory for everyone to have all of their dirty laundry aired. Not that there hasn't been a ton of it already, but again, I'm not surprised about this. I'm not even surprised about the fact that there was no money exchanged. It seemed like this is kind of where it was headed all along.
Yeah, I mean, I can believe the no money exchange for the same reason why I thought they were going to fight to the death. Like, I just did not see the defendant admitting to having done anything wrong here, or that I think we've always said from the very beginning that we thought it was going to be very hard for her to prove not only that this smear campaign actually happened, but also that it was connected to the sexual harassment complaint that she had made. And just stepping back a little footnote, we never covered this piece of the case on the podcast, but a few weeks ago, the judge issued a decision on the motion for summary judgment that Baldoni and the defendants had made. And what a summary judgment motion is something that you make at the end of the discovery phase of the case. And you basically say, here's all the facts that have come out in this case. And when we apply the law to them, this person doesn't have a sufficient claim to go to trial. And he was relatively successful in that motion. The judge dismissed the Title VII claims, which are the typical federal discrimination, sexual harassment, retaliation claims. A few other claims were dismissed. Ultimately, what she was left with, and she sort of spun this as a win, was a California state law retaliation claim. And that was really the primary claim that was going to go to trial. And at the time when this decision came out, Baldoni certainly spun it as this is a huge victory because the bulk of her case was dismissed. But she also spun it as a victory because she kind of, or her people sort of spun it as the real heart of this case was always the retaliatory smear campaign. And that is still in the case. Um, but ultimately now, she decided not to pursue it. So I'm not quite sure how you're going to spin that moving forward, or if you're just going to hope that the 24-hour news cycle moves on from this once there's not these recurring developments in the lawsuit anymore, and that people just forget about it. But I think it looks not great, certainly for her, because it's the plaintiff who ultimately has to stand behind their claims and go to a trial. I'm sure it was going to be messy. I'm sure there were probably a million witnesses that had absolutely no desire to come in and testify. I'm sure it was going to be extremely expensive to pay these like forensic I don't even know what the proper term for it would be, but these computer people who were going to try to prove that she actually lost, Instagram followers and business and, people buying her hair products and all this kind of stuff because of a smear campaign that we're still not 100% positive actually happened, because their argument all along has been no, you didn't approach the PR of this movie the right way, and people dug up interviews where you weren't very nice to interviewers and you just look bad, and this is all on you.
Yeah, I would say, I guess, well, first of all, this was confidential, the settlement, which is not unusual. People might think that it's scandalous that it's confidential, but many, many settlements are confidential, particularly in these kinds of cases for a number of reasons, and we've talked about those in the past. Um, I think there's an obvious upside for her having the settlement be confidential, in that she can walk away knowing that they are not going to be talking about this anymore. And I'm assuming there was like non-disparagement, like I said, mutually, which means you're not going to badmouth one another. And that might have been a good incentive for her people to settle the case before trial, because if they had taken it to trial and lost, then it would be open season for Baldoni's people to talk about this until they're blue in the face. Now, the flip side to that is, I'm sure, or this is the settlement suggests to me that Baldoni's people didn't think that this was a complete slam dunk for them, because if they did, they would have gone all the way to the mats and said, we are going to defend this case unless there's an open public discontinuance with no settlement. So the fact that they settled and agreed to some confidential terms means to me that they either got something in exchange for it, or they assessed some risk on their side.
Yeah, and
So
they did. And look, I don't think he looks, so great either. I
yeah.
mean, my understanding is that they stipulated at one point that her complaints that she made were what we call legally, quote unquote, protected activity, which means that they conceded that the complaints that she made were the types of sexual harassment complaints that the law protects. So in some ways, that was a little bit of a acknowledgement that at the very least the issues she raised were serious. And I think that, or serious enough to fall within the law. And I think that, and one of the things that did come out of this, which I suppose you could say is each side getting a little something out of it, is that they did release a joint statement. And part of that statement was an acknowledgement that, she had the right to be heard. So I think that what they're doing is, even in the stipulation, is like they're conceding the most minuscule thing possible in this case, which is just like, yes, okay, when you raised these issues, you were entitled to do that, and we were required to take it seriously because it was in, the bounds of, a protected complaint or whatever. That is like literally the smallest bone you could throw, but that's what they've acknowledged. And I did read here and there, and you don't know if any, and I don't see how you could confirm any of this. Even the fact that no money changed hands, I'm not really sure how people are confirming this. I looked on the docket this morning. There's nothing about the settlement even on the docket, just to say, in my experience, especially in federal court, the second a case settles, the judge is like very quick to put it on the docket. But I didn't necessarily see that on there. So I don't know where people are getting this information necessarily about the dollars and cents of it. Um, the attorneys are, of course, like the way the news represents this is, another sort of frivolous lawsuit that somebody brought that they couldn't be successful in. And that would apply to both of them because his claims got dismissed too. And the lawyers are the only winners because it's being reported that, I don't know if this is just one side or both sides together. I've seen the number many times, $60 million. I find this like mind blowing, being that this is the type of work that we do. And really, the main like financial piece of a case like this would be the experts. But I suppose if you have these big
Oof.
firm lawyers billing like $1,000 an hour, I still don't see how you're racking up $60 million in legal fees. But apparently, they do have an attorney fee the Blake Lively's lawyers do have an attorney fee application out there that I saw was potentially still alive in relation to his claims being dismissed. So apparently, the defamation claims that he made, there's a California statute that sort of protects people from being sued for defamation when they make complaints of sexual assault or sexual harassment. And I think that statute includes an attorney fee provision for the prevailing party in that type of case. So her lawyers, I mean, $60 million in legal fees to defend a defamation claim on a that you got
That's
out on
crazy.
a motion to dismiss is like mind blowing.
Yeah, and I would say it would be shocking to me that they would settle the case without resolving that piece of it.
Yeah,
So
I thought so too.
I think that's very unlikely.
Yeah.
Just before we wrap this topic, the Met Gala, she was apparently seen there.
Yeah, so she went, I think the same day that this announcement of the settlement was made, she went to the Met Gala. And, I don't know if you follow the Met Gala. She has been historically like a superstar of the Met Gala. I think she was a co-chair of it. But, unfortunately, this whole thing, I've probably brought this up every single time we've talked about the case. I've really struggled with this case because in our practice, we would be representing the her in this situation. Um, but we have always said, like, we've been very skeptical of whether this was going to be worth it for her in the long run. And if people maybe would have just forgotten, I feel like, especially, unfortunately, this happens, I think, to women, actresses more so than men, but people go through periods where they get very bad press and then everybody loves you again. And then now they think you're annoying again. And now they love you again. So I think it's safe to say that the bad PR that she got around this movie would have blown over. And the movie ended up being successful. And I saw the movie, I thought it was pretty good. And I do feel like a lot of this would have blown over.
Yep.
And the lawsuit really, from everything that I saw, and I tried to look at different perspectives, and there's one woman attorney who I actually think is from upstate New York who has really like supported her and kind of really explained the legal parts of it in a thoughtful way, and I appreciate that. But ultimately, I do think that she got the worst of the press on this.
Yeah.
And I just don't know if it's worth it. And the reason why I'm saying that I was reminded of it is from the Met Gala is I did not see one positive thing in the press about her being at the Met Gala. They thought it was like it's sort of almost like inappropriate in some ways that she had this huge lawsuit going and, was representing it as being very important and then the same day going to some big party. I don't know if I agree with that, but, I saw a picture of her and Anne Hathaway. They're like, oh, it's controversial now for Anne Hathaway to be in a picture with her because she, like basically took advantage of the Me Too movement when she brought this lawsuit and then she didn't even follow through with it. So I'm not saying any of that stuff is legitimate to say about her, but she has gotten nothing but bad press because of this. And I really don't know if it's worth it, especially in some ways because she decided not to pursue it all the way, which I do understand why she wouldn't, but it doesn't really look great, the optics
Yeah.
of letting this
I,
go when you've been so kind of aggressive about it as you should be if you're going to move forward in the first place. But I don't know. It's kind of I don't know.
yeah, I agree. In the end, I don't know if, and I have these conversations with clients often is the juice worth the squeeze? And one of the things that comes out of my mouth at least twice a week to somebody is, even though I'm a litigation attorney, I tend to talk people out of litigation quite frequently because there are always unintended consequences, and more so the more famous you are. Speaking of unintended consequences, this might be a good segue into what's got to be one of the strangest cases I've read about in a long time, which is the claims against an executive director of the JP Morgan, who was accused this week of sexual harassment by an apparent underling, and this thing has blown up so quickly on social media. And I'm just going to read the summary for people who are, not paying attention to this. Uh, Lorna Hajini.
I don't know.
I'm,
I don't think we're
all
pronouncing
right,
her name right.
all right, we'll call her Lorna. Has a female executive director of the JP Morgan has denied sexual harassment allegations made against her in a lawsuit this week. The complaint was filed in late April, which shared very lurid details from an ex-JP Morgan employee who identified in the complaint as John Doe, claiming that she had coerced him into sex, made racist remarks, and drugged him. He claimed that he was promoted that she was promoted into a senior role on his investment team and soon thereafter made sexual advances towards him. When he rejected those advances, he alleges that she threatened his career. He claimed a number of things, including on one occasion saying, "If you don't F my brains out tonight, I'm going to sabotage your promotion." That's a direct quote. And a bunch of quotes that were all over social media. Now,
Wait, say the one. Do you have the one about the fish? She called his wife like a fish face or something.
small-headed fish face. I think it was, I'll get the direct quote. Um, Something to the effect of, does your small-headed fish face of a wife have cannons like these? Okay. So that's what happened. The lawsuit was filed. JP Morgan came out swinging and denying this, and said, following our investigation, we don't believe there's any merit to these claims. While numerous employees cooperated with the investigation, the complainant, John Doe, refused to participate and has declined to provide facts that would be central to support his allegations. This is a JP Morgan's spokesperson. Um, so this came out last Friday, I think. In the subsequent days, the internet started trying to figure out who this person was. They outed him apparently, and his lawyer then filed a revised or amended complaint. I looked this whole case up on the docket because it's in New York. Um, he has now been the subject of significant online scrutiny about his past,
Where is
including
it in New York County or is it in federal court?
no, it's in New York County. There's been significant digging about his past. People are alleging that he claimed that his father was dying so that he could collect 3 months of paid leave, Apparently, when the New York Post called his father, he said, "quote I don't know anything about it. He didn't talk with us or anything. He's my son.
He
He's a
said he
good
was
guy."
dead.
Yeah. So anyway, this lawsuit's filed. They're denying it. And I find this whole thing really, really fascinating because he is getting a lot of flack. Oh, I didn't even talk about the last part. And then I'll let you talk. The last piece of this is that now the internet is saying that John Doe, allegedly went on a site that specializes in giving legal advice, like a Justia or Avo or one of those sites, and talked to an AI bot and asked what he could do after allegedly getting raped, sexually assaulted, harassed, and forced to do drugs by his former boss. Um, an attorney then joined the chat. This is an online chat. And John Doe said his career had been threatened and he'd been suffered. He said, according to the stuff that's online, at the time during this chat, he claimed that he was with Morgan Stanley and that his superior was a man. When in reality, now he's saying he was at JP Morgan and his superior was a woman. People were using that to suggest that he was basically, shopping his story, testing his story to see how it would go. I actually think there's a more legitimate reason for it, if in fact this is true. The long and the short of it is that JP Morgan and his supervisor are adamantly denying this. I did look up his lawyers, and it's a what looks to be, at least online, a fairly reputable New York City employment law firm. So who has now, since this happened, filed an amended complaint which features two affirmations from individuals, one of whom is John Doe's brother, that basically say that they saw this woman acting drunk and saying these kind of crazy, outlandish things to him. So what do we think? What do you think about this? This is something.
I don't know. It's crazy. Like, well, what I was seeing also is that, I mean, she obviously said came out with a statement that said this was a complete fabrication, not just, I deny it or I'm doing this, but that this is an outright, like, just made up story. Um, JP Morgan seemed like it was sort of taking that angle a little bit. From what I understand, from just a purely factual perspective, he was not at this company for very long. And my understanding is that she was not his superior. So I think there's some factual, just not, juicy factual things, but just sort of threshold factual things that are being disputed. Yeah, it's just a crazy story with like him saying his dad died so he could take bereavement leave. I think that was spun as like during his bereavement leave was when he was getting his ducks in a row potentially for this lawsuit. I mean, some of the stuff that he has accused her of doing, I mean, obviously any sort of like drugging or sexual assault or all those things are serious allegations, but some of the things that he said that she said to him are just so outrageous. They're either, I feel like we have come across this in our practice where some things are either so outrageous that you're like, this has to be made up, or they're so outrageous that they have to be true because you're like, nobody would say this sentence, like, nobody could make this sentence up if it wasn't true. But yeah, it is pretty crazy.
Yeah, she's calling him like brown boy and saying all this crazy stuff. I have a couple of thoughts on this. Legally, if in fact his supervisor was demanding sex in exchange for continued employment or promotion, that is by definition quid pro quo sexual harassment. You can't do that. Um, I I find it. I think it would be pretty crazy if he was just making this whole thing up, and there are two people who submitted affirmations to the court that are also just completely making this stuff up. The lawyer, you would think, has vetted these claims to some extent before making them, and had to have known that this was going to make splashy headlines. And lawyer's obligation is to obviously, you can take your client's word for it, and you can have your client verify that what they're saying is true, and that's enough. But in this situation, it seems like the lawyer did even more than that and went out and got, statements from people who are saying that, yeah, this type of behavior was accurate. We saw it firsthand. So it seems to me like, despite what might be some credibility problems with this guy, I would be surprised if he was just if this whole thing was fabricated. That would surprise me. But I also think, as you said, it's somewhat unusual how aggressively JP Morgan seems to be coming out against it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think people might wonder, so when like JP Morgan says we did an investigation that he wouldn't participate in, that would be, I think, relevant. That being said, if he wasn't working there anymore, which I don't think he is, then I don't think there's any obligation to come in and participate in their
Sure.
investigation. I mean, we always tell people if we speak to employees who are still working and they have a complaint, I do always tell people participate in the investigation. You can't make a complaint and then refuse to participate. You're going to end up getting, fired, or the investigation is not going to be able to continue because you're not participating in it. And it sounds like that's kind of obvious, but it isn't really. A lot of people will make a complaint and then maybe because they don't feel comfortable with the way HR is handling it, or their employer, if they're a big company, brings in another law firm to handle the investigation and they feel that they're combative. I mean, a lot of people don't feel supported when they make a complaint in the investigation. But that being said, I always tell people you need to participate because you need to show them that, you're trying to do the right thing and taking this seriously, or you wouldn't have made the complaint in the first place. So I don't know that that's such a red flag, unless, he was still working there. But
Agreed.
yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I think a lot of it blew up. I know this isn't very nice to say, but we should probably just acknowledge it because this is like legitimately, I think, one of the reasons why it blew up. I mean, not only was it kind of salacious allegations that he's making against her that I think at first people were like, oh my God, this is shocking. But then like some pictures of him came out. He's like a little, making fun of some of these tabloids are sort of making fun of his looks and they're sort of questioning. Now, if the roles were reversed, I certainly would not say someone's claims of, sexual harassment or sexual assault aren't credible just based on how they look, because I don't think that really has anything to do with it. But in terms of the public reaction to this and how it sort of blew up into like some kind of parody, I think some of his credibility issues, like saying his dad was dead when he wasn't, coupled with sort of like some visual things that have gone up on the internet, have not really helped. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we're plaintiffs' lawyers. Like we tend to give other plaintiffs' lawyers the benefit of the doubt, especially if it's a reputable law firm. And like you said, I mean, the hardest part of employment cases, we've always said, is you're taking your client's word for a lot. You don't have access to any of the employer's documents with a private company ahead of litigation. So, and a lot of sexual harassment and sexual assault in general, whether it's criminal or civil or whatever, is he said, she said. So if you're assessing your client's credibility and you believe them and you have done the best fact checking that you possibly can, it is what it is. If you have a good faith reason, basis to move forward, then you move forward. Is it possible that a case can fall apart at some point because your client wasn't truthful? Sure.
Yeah, and you're right. You don't have access to the JP Morgan internal investigation. That cuts both ways, though. I did read something that suggests that JP Morgan was suggesting that they were trying to settle this. That John Doe's people came to them pre-suit and tried to settle it for a lot of money, and they refused. And when they refused, they filed the lawsuit. Again, being someone who works in this field, that's not unusual either. If we have a case that we think is strong on the merits and we think it's very clean, we often give the other side an opportunity to settle it because that's all you can do in litigation in most cases is get money for your client. And if the case is clear and we think that it's obvious what they did wrong, we'll sometimes do that. And that's not unusual to have those conversations. And if they fall apart or if they're not responsive, you just move forward with a lawsuit. So they're spinning that, but practically that happens all the time. And so the only other comment I'll make is we've had multiple cases, employment cases in particular, where the comments that were made were so off the wall that somebody would would be like, "You're this is crazy." And in those cases, in our experience, they turned out to have been true. What was said was actually said. Stuff that you're like, "Oh my God, you can't make this up." But it's like a classic truth is stranger than fiction situation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely periodically will have a consultation with someone where they will tell me something that someone has said to them in like 2026, and I am like flabbergasted. But yeah, so that I'll kind of be interested to see how that shakes out. The only little footnote I wanted to say about just from a legal standpoint is that he filed as a John Doe, and I think there's a little bit of a misperception that you can do that, but you really can't. You have to be willing to stand behind your allegations with your name. I think he's kind of taking the position that, and you have to apply to the court to do that as well. And I think he's kind of taking the position that the tabloids picked up on this, and now his family and his privacy are at risk, which I get. But typically you don't do that. And the only times you really will see that is with minors in like nasty kind of situations. You don't see that as a matter of course. And I've never seen it really in an employment case.
Yep, yep, totally agree. All right, one more before we go. Last episode, we talked about Kash Patel and his new lawsuit against The Atlantic arising out of defamation. Uh, Either the same day or the following day, a federal judge in Texas dismissed a different lawsuit that Kash Patel had filed against an MS Now columnist after the columnist suggested on the air that Patel spent more time in nightclubs than at the Bureau's headquarters. So Cash seems like someone who can't let things sit and wants to go on the offensive. And in the decision, the U.S. District Court judge said that Patel had failed to allege a viable defamation claim against the columnist and former FBI official. A quote from the decision it said, "A person of reasonable intelligence and learning would not have taken his statement literally that Director Patel has actually spent more hours physically in a nightclub than he has spent physically in his office building." Uh, and it went on to say, by saying that Patel spent far more time at nightclubs than his office, uh, he had delivered his answer in an exaggerated, provocative, and amusing way by employing rhetorical hyperbole. So, not remotely surprising, but why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much to say about it, but yeah, I mean, defamation only applies to statements of fact that, a reasonable person is going to take as a fact. So something that can be framed much more as an opinion or, like you said, hyperbole is not going to be protected the same way, a flat out. I think it is universally, from everything that I saw reported on it, universally believed that his case against the Atlantic, it will be dismissed as well.
Yep.
That being said, I mean, I think there were probably more statements of fact in an in-depth, sort of more serious article like that is saying like you were seen doing X, Y, and Z, as opposed to kind of like a talking head on a TV show or whatever that was. Just making sort of a joke. But yeah, obviously he's showing himself in the spirit of the podcast of being litigious. I don't really know that that is going to help him because, again, going back to the Blake Lively, it doesn't make you look good when you go around filing lawsuits and then having them get dismissed.
Well, like we said last time, I say it again. I think he has taken the wrong lesson from President Trump's tactics of filing lawsuits against media companies that he thinks have done him wrong. And like it or not, and agree with it or not, I think everybody can acknowledge that Trump has had some success with that. And I think Patel may have thought that this was an easier game than it actually is, and would have thought that these outlets are all just going to roll over, which is clearly not the case. And it if there is a legitimate defamation, then by all means, but it's proving that that is not what's happening here. But all you need to file a lawsuit is a couple $100 in a dream, and that's what happened.
Yeah.
Anything
Well,
else?
I did have one last little thing that is more like a public service announcement of something that we saw
Oh, yeah.
on um Instagram today. So I think this is just a cautionary tale in general. So I saw a business owner post a reel on Instagram, kind of complaining about how in this day and age, he as a business owner has to deal with the mental health of his employees and how he doesn't have time to deal with the mental health of his employees, et cetera, et cetera. And it was kind of a rant. He was definitely sort of worked up about it. And, as a Gen X person, and maybe this guy is a millennial, I do think that there is a little bit of a divide in what people perceive to be like the work ethic of people our age and potentially the younger generation. For better or worse, I think that some of the younger generation deserves credit for refusing to deal with, toxic workplaces and prioritizing their mental health and their quality of life and things like that. But I do understand that that can sometimes permeate into the workplace where there might be a little bit of a work ethic divide. All of that being said, your legitimate mental health conditions that are diagnosed are disabilities within the meaning of the law. So I find it not very prudent for an employer to very publicly and very sort of adamantly say that it is not his job to manage his employees' mental health, because it actually is an employer's job to manage their employees' mental health under certain circumstances. So I thought this was very dicey. I thought to myself, he should take this down. The comments were not positive. For all the comments that were like, right on, this generation doesn't know how to work, there was a lot of like, this is very problematic, what you have said. Um, I think we've talked about this in the past. Like, if you're an employer, you have to be conscious of what you put out into the universe when it comes to your strong opinions. Because, say, now one of his employees comes up to him and says, hey, I need FMLA leave intermittently to go to therapy for anxiety. Okay. And he denies it. What is like exhibit A of my FMLA interference lawsuit? My employer going on giving a speech about how this is not his problem.
Yeah, it definitely one of the things you have to one of the things you try to establish in those cases is what's known as discriminatory animus, meaning you have a uh, an animosity towards a particular group or condition, and I can totally see somebody in a deposition pulling up a video of that and just saying, doesn't this you tell me what you think about people with mental health conditions, and you're scrambling then. So it's a classic example of like what's the upside to posting a video like that? There is none. There's no
Yeah,
there's no
or
upside.
talk about work ethic and not, mental health. Like I understand,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I get, I think what he was trying to say, but the second he said it, I was like, whoa, no, no, no.
Yeah.
Because of like you said, and I think two things. One, on the discriminatory animus, that is correct in disability discrimination cases. You do have to prove that. And the standard is actually pretty high. So this would be, I would think, like a great piece of evidence for an employment lawyer to dig up, because it's actually a pretty high burden to prove that in a disability discrimination case. With my example with the FMLA, you don't have to prove discriminatory animus. You just have to prove that that your employer did not give you the leave that you were entitled to. So again, that would be relevant in a situation like this where someone's saying, this is not my job. I mean, I would rely on that and say this person doesn't know, what their job is in this situation. And that's why and so they don't know when they have to give leave and when they don't, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
just thought that was a cautionary tale. I understand, like, in this day and age, especially in businesses that rely really heavily on their social media to market themselves, that they may feel like a constant need for content. And maybe that just causes you to sort of, and I think a lot of people have, I'm sure, gotten themselves in trouble with this kind of thing where you just make your little reel and you ranting and raving in the moment and you post it because you need views and you need content and whatever. And you don't realize that it could have like an actual ramification. Aside from, I mean, some people do, I think, thrive. I certainly am not this type of person who thrive on like a back and forth with commenters who are going to
Yeah.
give you negative comments. They think like, oh, any engagement is good. I get that, and that could be true. I would be like taking something down immediately, probably if somebody was like, "How dare you?"
Yeah.
Um, Unless it was just a factual conversation. But that being said, I just feel like in this situation, it kind of crossed the line because this wasn't like, oh, somebody wrote me a negative review and I'm gonna, make a comment about it. This is like something that could substantively, I think, impact, you know, your employees and your liability and all that.
Yep. PSA to business owners, don't do that. Be cautious with your online ranting. Um, all right. Anything else?
No, I did have one more. It's not even a PSA. It's just like in the theme of our anti-cruise ship podcast that these people are still languishing in the ocean with this hantavirus, which was like a strange, very obscure childhood fear that I had because it's like a rodent-borne disease, and I'm afraid of mice and rats.
Yeah, it's
But I
sad
mean,
too
this is like
because
reason number 8 million why I cannot put myself in this type of confined space.
yeah, this is like a nice cruise though. It's like an adventurer's cruise
Yeah,
to
it's horrific. People died. It's very sad and just
yeah,
horrible. But
scary,
they are
very
trapped on this thing. They're not letting them off. I don't know if they've let some people off, but for a while they were not letting anybody off.
we'll be covering the inevitable lawsuits that come around out of this. Well, it's in it from Spain, I think the boat, so it might not happen in the US, but um all right. Well, with
Okay,
that
that's it. I'm
on
done.
that positive note, we will be back again, I think next week. Thanks everyone for listening. If you have questions, hit us up at Instagram at Litigious Podcast. As always, share, like, subscribe, and we will be back again soon.